Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Inside Injuries podcast for Week 6 of the NFL season. I am here with Virginia Zakis of Inside Injuries. My name is Tim McCullough. I'm your host, and we're going to take a look at some of the injuries for Week 6, some of the players that are injured, whether or not they can try and give you an idea of whether or not they're going to be playing. If they're not going to be playing this week, when can we expect them back? And we also have some questions from our listeners that we're going to address during the podcast here. We try and keep this short and sweet, but we try and get to as much as we can during our time here. Don't forget, we're brought to you by Inside Injuries, where you can get the inside edge on NFL injuries and be a step ahead of your competition. All right, Virginia, how are you this afternoon?
Doing well. Hard to believe it's another, we're already in week 6.
Yeah, I mean, next week we'll be talking about the halfway point in most fantasy leagues.
Yeah.
And that's kind of crazy. All right, let's get right into it, though, Virginia. Jay Ajayi, we lost him this past week for the rest of this season. So we really kind of have to just look long-term as far as he's concerned. We certainly won't be seeing him back this year. Do you think he can be ready for 2019?
Yes, I do think he'll be ready for 2019. It sounds like right now this was likely just an isolated ACL tear. But unfortunately, we're still missing a lot of information here. Jay Ajayi previously had issues with his knee. He tore his ACL back in 2011. Again, don't know if it's the same knee or not. And that has led to a chronic condition with his cartilage where his knee is basically bone on bone. So we've known all along, we've always had him at least an elevated injury risk for this reason, because we knew his knee could act up at any time. Don't necessarily think that would have led to the ACL tear, because cartilage and ligaments are more for stability. Cartilage is not. But again, he was an elevated injury risk. We knew his knees were a problem. So I do think he'll be ready to return, but his knees are going to continue to be a very serious concern. And if this was the other knee, we know that ACL tears are more likely to occur in the opposite knee if one has already been torn. So still waiting on some information, but hope he can be back next year, but likely won't be 100%.
Yeah, and thinking about the fantasy value, we had some questions about the value of some of the other running backs in that backfield. That's a mess now, this situation. I think for week 6, Wendell Smallwood's probably the guy to own. He actually grades out a little bit better than Clement as far as this week's competition goes. But I think if Clement is healthy and stays healthy, he's probably the guy to own for the rest of the season. And, of course, all of this assumes that the Eagles don't make a trade for another player. It depends on what they think they can do. They've got Darren Sproles coming back at some point. If not this week, probably next, or after the bye. I don't see any reason why they can't go with that 3-headed monster for the rest of the way. But the Eagles have been linked to a number of different players as far as the trade is concerned. We've heard rumors about them looking at Le'Veon Bell and trying to put something together with Pittsburgh. There was a recent rumor about them looking at LaShawn McCoy, with the Buffalo Bills not having much to play for this season, except their pride. There's a good chance that they could let McCoy go in a trade, especially if they can get something that builds for their future in return. He had a reasonably productive day last week. 26 touches, 108 yards. So McCoy can still do it as long as he's healthy. And he's doing it even with the Bills' passing game being almost non-existent. Bring him to Philadelphia, and he could be a dynamic runner for them again. He's still got it, even at his age. So McCoy is a certain possibility. And then, of course, there's the most recent rumor, which has them looking at Jordan Howard, of all people, from Chicago. He'd be a really odd fit in the Eagles system, but he'd be a definite upgrade over Clement or Smallwood. So it's certainly a possibility, but not one that I put a lot of stock in. I think McCoy is the more reasonable one. Any one of those backs, though, coming to the Eagles would throw the fantasy value of Clement and certainly Smallwood into the wind. And, you know, and then what do you do? So I wouldn't invest much stock in either of the Philadelphia Eagles running backs at this point. And Sproles really isn't playable, except outside of maybe DFS leagues. All right, moving on. Let's take a look at Adrian Peterson, Washington Redskins. This was kind of a funny week. I thought it was kind of a funny week. He had multiple shoulder dislocations last week, and there was talking of him getting multiple opinions, and there was also some concern that he might not even be able to play. What is the story with Peterson? What's his overall injury risk going forward, and can we even bother with playing him?
So Peterson was already a high injury risk, mainly due to he had that season-ending neck injury last year that had even threatened to end his career. Then he already suffered that ankle injury a few weeks ago. Now it's his shoulder. There was one play where his arm was kind of outstretched and he landed hard on his side. That's where it appeared to dislocate. And then there was another time in the game where it looked like he dislocated it again. Sometimes this just causes the ligaments to stretch out a little bit. It doesn't cause much damage. The player is kind of sore and the arm is really stiff for a few weeks, but then they're usually fine. This one, just based on the mechanism of the injury, looked like it could have caused some serious damage, such as a labral tear. If that's the case, very, very painful. Would likely eventually need surgery, but he could try to play through it. And I suspect that that's also why he's decided to get multiple opinions on his shoulder to determine how severe it is. Can he cause more damage by playing through it? Trying to figure out some stuff like that. So I think he's going to try to play. I don't think this is going to end his season right now. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they don't announce until the end of the year the actual injury he's dealing with. But I think this is going to affect his play a little bit. And again, even if he tries to play through it, wouldn't be surprised if he isn't able to go this weekend just because it's such a painful injury. He'd have to wear a brace on his arm. It would affect his ball security. And he already has these other injury concerns as well. So it might make sense to give him a few weeks off to recover.
Yeah, and as far as Peterson's fantasy value going forward, I don't think his fantasy value is any better now than it was when at the beginning of the season, at which point we were looking at a potential dumpster fire. Peterson's he's got 242 rushing yards so far over 4 games. He's gaining 4 yards per carry, which from a football standpoint isn't bad. But from a fantasy standpoint, he's not doing great. He does have 3 touchdowns and another 136 yards out of the backfield. I wouldn't have wanted to own him at the beginning of the season, and I certainly wouldn't want to own him now that he's banged up with the potential to miss time if he gets banged up any worse. I wouldn't want any part of this. Chris Thompson is probably going to be taking over more of a workload, especially if Peterson can't go this week or is limited in any way. We'll see Thompson sort of step up his participation in the games. And they've got Capri Bibbs, they've got Fat Rob Kelly, but, neither of those guys are real difference makers in terms of fantasy football. And Thompson is more of a PPR guy than anything else. It's a kind of a tough situation and not one I would want any part of if I had my choice. All right, let's move on to Matt Breida. Every week we kind of hear that Breida's hurt. He might not be coming back, and then the next thing you know, he's playing. Is that going to be the case this week? Is this ankle injury serious enough to keep him down? If he's not going to play this week, when do you think he'll be back?
Yeah, I don't see any way where Breida returns this week. They were kind of, I think, misleading with their diagnosis. They said he didn't suffer a high ankle sprain, but he suffered a mid ankle sprain. That's pretty much a made up diagnosis. That doesn't really mean anything. But we do know that this is a pretty serious ankle sprain. even if it's not a high ankle sprain, which is generally the worst kind. We're still showing a grade 2 injury, and that comes with an optimal recovery time of at least 4 weeks. So a lot of the time players return before our optimal recovery time, but they're nowhere near 100%. And medically, it just doesn't make sense. But yeah, I see no way he plays this week. If for some reason he does play, I don't see him finishing the game, don't see him being productive at all. Really, that's the case for the next few weeks if he does suit up. So this, I think, is going to be the injury that finally forces him to sit for a few weeks. And I think his injury risk is going to continue to be in that elevated high injury risk for at least the next 2 months.
Yeah, it's funny. People are asking me who should they own if Breida can't go, and I look at them and say, well, let's see, Alfred Morris, and that's really all they've got. I mean, they've got Kyle just checked, but I can't see bothering with him. Morris had 91 yards last week. He's the guy that needs to be rostered if you are counting on Breida and want to replace him. He was dropped. Morris was a droppable commodity just as recently this last week, and a lot of people did let him go based on the fact that he wasn't being very productive, and Breida was ending up playing every week anyway. So you might still be able to get your hands on Morris for this week, and I definitely think he's worth owning, especially in standard formats. Yeah, I think the most telling thing really about Breida's injury, though, was the fact that the 49ers felt that they had to bring in 5 running backs for auditions this week. They had Sharkhandrick West, Matthew Deas, Andre Ellington, Shane Vereen, and Jeremy McNichols all come in to interview and or audition on the field for them. And oddly enough, the only guy they felt fitting to sign was Matthew Deas. So that kind of tells you what the status of the running back market is out there. Guys like West and Ellington and Vereen, they're done. They're just not rosterable players in football. And if they're not rosterable in the NFL, they're certainly not rosterable in fantasy. All right, moving on. This is another frustrating player, and that's Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings. Are we going to see him come back this week? And is this hamstring, thing going to be a problem for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I think he's got a shot at returning this week. He got in I believe, a limited practice on Wednesday, so at least he's progressing. They never said it, but I really believe he suffered a setback when he returned for that Thursday night game, which was roughly 10 days after his original injury. That's way too soon for a hamstring strain, especially for a running back. So it's now been, by this weekend, it'll be 2.5 weeks. We're showing a 4-week optimal recovery time from when we believe he was re-injured, which really means he should wait until week 7 to be safe. I mean, we've already seen with Fournette how easy it is to cause these hamstring strains to linger. Same thing with guys like Will Fuller. Hamstrings are just so difficult to overcome. So he's going to be a high risk if he returns this weekend. Best to give it another week or two. And this is something, even when he does return for the next month or so, we're going to need to keep a close eye on.
Yeah, that's a tough situation fantasy-wise, too, in Minnesota, because Latavius Murray has really been a disappointment in Cook's place. 13 touches, 56 yards last week. And then, they started giving the rock to Rock Thomas to get the goal line carries. Murray really is so touchdown dependent for his fantasy value. You start taking them away and getting them to another player, and suddenly Murray is not rosterable in fantasy play. I'd hang on to Cook. I really think that when he comes back, he's an RB1. He's that dynamic. He's that good. We saw it in the first week of play when he was in there. Cook's the guy you want to have. I think Murray's not worth bothering, not worth the roster space, just because he's just hasn't been impressive at all and is so touchdown dependent. All right, let's take a look at the Packers as we move towards the end here. The Packers running back situation is a mess, and so is their wide receiver situation. who's going to play this weekend, Virginia? Who's going to get healthy and who's going to be able to play?
So I'll start with Devontae Adams. He's the easy one. He played last week, which is really surprising. Since he picked up a midweek calf injury, they're very tough injuries to play through, and he did really well. So that was very surprising. It sounds like he made it through the game without a setback, so he should be good to go. Still an elevated injury risk, but should be fine this weekend. Randall Cobb has been sidelined for a few weeks with this hamstring injury. I think he has a chance to return this week, but it's all going to depend how practice goes. I think he started to test it out last week and he just wasn't ready yet. So we're showing a healthy to return date in week 7. So best to sit for another week, but I think there's a chance he goes. Would be a risky guy to have in lineups though if he is active. And then there's Geronimo Allison, who is still in concussion protocol. They thought he was going to clear ahead of the game last week, but didn't end up getting cleared. Again, this is one of those cases until we see his practice statuses and we see him progressing, getting in a limited practice and then hopefully a full practice. We don't really know how close he is. You can never predict how players are going to recover from concussions. So he has a good shot at clearing. A majority of players clear concussion protocol within 2 weeks, but there's really just no way to know at this point.
Yeah. For the rest of the season, I think, Adams is the guy to own. If he's healthy, and even if he's not completely healthy, if he's playing, you have to start him because he's the go-to guy, for Aaron Rodgers. And he's the guy that you have to own. I like Cobb when he's playing, but he's not the guy that he's been in seasons past, and I haven't been real impressed with his play this year. So I'm not so hot on him for the rest of this season and going forward. As far as some of these other guys go, Valdez-Scantling and St. Brown, I'm not real thrilled, especially with Brown. Most of what he got last week, which was 3 receptions, 89 yards on 5 targets. Most of what he got came on 1 play. So I wasn't real impressed with his play last week. I'm not sure that he's going to have much, if any, value going forward. Valdez-Scantling is a little bit more intriguing, though. He had 10 targets last week, 7 receptions, 68 yards, and a touchdown. He's certainly capable of stepping up when it's necessary, and when players like Allison and Cobb are not in there, and he makes for an interesting DFS play. But other than that, I'm not going to use a roster spot for Valdez-Scantling unless I'm certain that either Cobb or Allison or both of them are going to be out. Interesting situation there for the Packers. Clearly Adams is the guy you want, though. There's no question about it. All right, moving on to the Rams wide receivers. A lot of people are asking about Cooper Kupp and Brandon Cooks and whether or not these guys are going to clear concussion protocol and play this week. What's your take on that, Virginia?
So I'll start by saying that I'm very, very concerned about Brandon Cooks, way more than Cooper Kupp, mainly because Cooks, this is his 2nd concussion in the last year and 3rd in the last 3 years. That's a serious red flag. When players have had multiple concussions and then on top of that, 2 within a year, that is a huge, huge, huge concern. So he was already at an increased injury risk because of that. Now his injury risk is very, very high. He should not play this weekend, even if he does technically clear all the steps in concussion protocol. It would not be a smart decision. But I will say that Kupp and Cooks participated in the walkthrough yesterday. The team is saying both are on track to clear. But again, like we said with Allison, you just don't know how a player is going to respond once they get in a limited practice and start to really run around and really ramp up their activities. So both hope to play this weekend. I guess Cooks is a guy you probably need to have in lineups if he's active, but I just don't trust him. And with this history of concussions, I'm very concerned about him long term.
Yeah, it's funny. Everybody wondered why the Patriots let Cooks go willing to trade him away after he led the team in receiving last year, and has been such a consistent player over the last 3 years. And I have a funny feeling, I have an inkling that this concussion history may have something to do with it. He came down with a concussion last year, and many felt that it wasn't a play on which he should have gotten one, and yet he did. Do you think there's any merit to that, Virginia? That Patriots management, specifically our buddy Bill Belichick, saw the concussion history and the fact that he got one so easily last year and said, I want no part of that this season?
Yeah, it's very, very possible. And I mean, we know that concussions, once they start to pile up like this, they're easier and easier to get. Instead of, it doesn't take necessarily slamming your head to the turf or, a helmet to helmet hit. It can be something as simple as a little whiplash that causes you to get a concussion. So definitely possible that they saw that with Cooks and said, we don't want any part of that going forward.
Yeah, I wouldn't be at all be surprised. Now, if neither player can go this week, Kupp and Cooks, there's a question from some of our subscribers about who steps up if both players can't go. Well, that's a good question. In terms of receivers, I don't know that they need anybody to step up. They've got Robert Woods, who's has been arguably one of their top two receivers. In terms of statistics, he's right up there with Kupp and Cooks. He's got 415 receiving yards to Kupp's 438 and Cooks' 452. So he's right up there in terms of those yards, and he's got 3 touchdowns. Cooks only got 5, and Cooks has 1. So Woods has been a dynamic player for them and done a great job. And between him and Todd Gurley, who has 230 receiving yards and a pair of receiving touchdowns on his own, I don't know that they need anybody to actually step up. But of course, everybody's looking for a sleeper or some sort of edge here. So the guy to probably look at in terms of the wide receiver position is Josh Reynolds. But I have to be honest with you, as far as fantasy value goes, I wouldn't have him as any more than, say, maybe a real deep league choice or perhaps as a DFS play. He's only got 2 receptions for 39 yards so far this season. Not particularly impressive. And that's from 4 targets. Yes, Reynolds will get an opportunity to step up, but I just don't see it happening. Not with Woods there, being the guy who's been getting open and making big plays for them all season long. Anyway, and Todd Gurley, who's been their go-to guy for forever. As long as he's been there. All right, and that just about wraps things up for us, Virginia, for Week 6. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in and checking out our Week 6 podcast from Inside Injuries. Don't forget, this is where you can get the inside edge on injuries around the NFL and get a leg up on your competition. As far as checking us out on the web, it's insideinjuries.com, and you can also check out on Twitter at InsideInjuries, and my Twitter handle is at Tim's10s, that's TimsTenz. And Virginia, you want to give them your Twitter handle as well?
Yeah, it's at VZakas, Zakas.
All right. Of course, you can hit any of us up with questions over the weekend. I'll be updating my rankings on a daily basis. You can get them exclusively at Inside Injuries. And, of course, Virginia will have articles out over the weekend. I'll have my start sit coming out later today. And Virginia will wrap up all the injuries before Sunday. Good luck to you in Week 6, and we will be back for you next week, Week 7. Until then, for Virginia Zakas, I'm Tim McCullough. Take care. Bye.